Okay. はい、それでは、今週のウィークエンドセミナー始めていきたいと思います。今週は、ドンに来ていただいていますので、ライティングタスク2で求められる段落構成ということで、このセミナーを行っていきます。今日の流れなんですけれども、まずはドンにタスク2の書き方について解説をいただきまして、その後にモデルアンサーを一緒に見ていくことになりますので、2部構成になっていきますけれども、タスク2の、プランニングのことも含めてですね、あとは、段落をどのように、構成していって議論を進めていくかというところも見ていきますし、あともう少し細かい点ですね、特に、段落の中で議論をどうつなげていくのかということも解説していただきますので、いろいろ、ね、参考になるかなと思います。モデルアンサーはまたゆっくり、このセミナー後に参考にしてください。質問のある方はですね、チャットの方でいつでも送っていただけましたら、このセミナーの最後にまとめて回答しますので、いつでもそちらの方から送ってください。Alright, so Don, we're going to get started, I think,
Okay.
and then
Yuki.
get you to just explain a little bit about how to plan an essay, and then before we move on to looking at the model answer that we have here.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Yuki. And so tonight we're just going to look at planning a task 2 essay. And that means, first of all, analysing what the task is. And one of the problems with many responses in IELTS task 2s is that the candidate fails to actually address all parts of the task. And this is the first assessment criterion. In other words, 25% of the mark in an IELTS task 2 writing. So if you fail to actually analyse the task and address all parts of the task equally, then that will be a problem for your score. We're also going to look at some of the ways that you can express an opinion in an opinion essay, which is what a task 2 is. And we will look at some of the ways that you might actually expand your knowledge of certain subjects before the test, long before the test. We'll look quickly at a little article from an online magazine called The Conversation, which we've mentioned once or twice before. So anyway, let's start by looking at the task. And this task comes from a book which I have some involvement in, which is on the bookshelves in Japan at the moment. And it's the IDP IELTS preparation book. And it's a very good book. So Yuki has a surprise for those people who are listening tonight, but I'll let him explain that later on. So here is the question. Again, always in IELTS task 2, we begin with a statement. And the statement is, some people believe that having fewer children is the best way to preserve the world's limited resources. And this statement continues. It's a complex statement because it has two parts. Others believe that technology is the answer and that population control is unnecessary. So here, this is a quite complex statement to begin with. The response that we're asked to give is also quite complex because there are three parts to this. Discuss each of those views and give your own opinion. So this is one of the harder IELTS task 2 types of questions because the statement is complicated and the response that is asked for is also not simple. So we ask ourselves some questions. How many parts are there to this statement? Well, there are three parts, I'd say. First part is population control will preserve the world's resources. The second one, technology can preserve the world's resources. And this other point, which is important, population control is unnecessary. Now, that's an important element in the statement. And then we ask ourselves, okay, how many things am I asked to say? What is the response? And of course, you must discuss the first view. Then you must discuss the second view, that population control is not important and that technology will solve the problem. And then you have to give your own opinion. Now, this opinion could be one of the previous two opinions, or it could be a quite different opinion. You might say, for example, that it's not technology and it's not population control. It's simply making people wealthier. And wealthy people don't have as many children and they use their resources more sensibly, or they conserve resources or something like that. So that's okay. If you have a completely different view, then express it, but please support it with some evidence. Okay, so we move on. We understand what the task is. So we have to ask ourselves some questions. We have to ask ourselves some questions about the views and about our position. And this is brainstorming, basically. And it's a skill that you can develop. It's a skill that is not always a natural one for many people, and you need to practice it. So I always suggest that you just ask yourself a lot of questions, and that's my method of brainstorming. Well, what is my experience of this issue? So, in other words, what is my experience of preserving resources? Do I have long showers, for example, or do I make sure that I conserve water? Am I conscious of recycling? Am I trying to use an electric car instead of a petrol car? All of these things are trying to make the whole issue a personal one. And if you do that, you will have a lot of ideas because it will mean something to you. And remember, in an IELTS Task 2, you are asked to support your opinion with examples from your own experience and knowledge. So if you say, yes, I own an electric car, or my parents own an electric car for this reason, then that is perfectly okay in an IELTS Task 2. Then we ask ourselves another question: what are the world's resources? Because this question is talking about the world's limited resources. But what does that mean? Well, it means fossil fuels, petroleum, gas. It means water as well, which is a really important resource. It will mean forests. It will mean wood. It will mean things like that as well. You might even want to talk about natural resources like flora and fauna, the sorts of things that are being lost when you cut down trees, animal habitat and things like that. So it's a big question. But you don't have to talk about all of these things. You can choose one or two to explain your position. And the model answer that we're going to look at doesn't look at most of that stuff at all. It looks at one particular example, China, and it speaks in general terms about the rest. You might ask yourself the next question: C, what are some examples of population control? Well, there's a big one, and that is the Chinese experience, where you limit the size of families. There was a policy in India many years ago of people being asked to undergo operations so that they could not have children. There might be other things as well. There might be taxation that would encourage people to have fewer children. All of those things are important for us to think about because they will help us come up with ideas for our essay. And then we might ask ourselves a general question, well, whose problem is this? Is it my problem? Or is it a problem for the government? Is it a problem for industry and business? They're the ones who use the resources, for example. And again, you might have different opinions about that, but you might ask yourself, well, what is the most important of these? So you might, if you look at the previous questions, you might say, well, the most important resource in the world is water, or it might be energy, or you might say the most important actor in looking after these problems might be the government, or it might be just the individual. And then you might ask yourself, well, what are some examples of conservation, the protection of resources, of population control, etc. And they could be local ones or they could be international ones. So all of those things should occur in about 2 minutes because you don't have a long time to prepare your answer. And you need to flesh out a plan very quickly in order to give yourself time to write 250 words. But I would encourage you to practice making a plan. So how do you make a good plan? We'll look at point 3 here. How do we make a point? How do we explain our point? Well, this is one way of planning as well. Okay, my point is that water resources are the most important thing. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that we should use water properly in agriculture and also in households. And let's give an example of that. Maybe we should rely on a particular types of plumbing in cities, for example, or reusing wastewater. So having a method of making a point and then supporting your point, explaining and then giving an example is very important. And we will see in our model essay today a good model of how to do that. So the 4th point here is you need to have a method, a methodology of planning. And that means you're able to do it quickly. Now, when you plan something, and this goes for your speaking test in IELTS as well, you don't write full sentences, right, in the 1 minute preparation part 2. You just write down key words. And a key word will give you a lot of information. So in the first paragraph, okay, what are a couple of key words that I want to use to express my position and the context for my position? So you might think of synonyms for what is in the question. Fewer children, right? Having less babies or smaller families, for example. And you might want to put down what your position is. And you might put a key word there, technology is the most important. Things like solar power and wind power, you might put down those words. In the second paragraph, you're going to discuss one of the views, right? And in the third paragraph, you'll discuss the other view. So the second paragraph, what are your key words for discussing the pros and cons? And a discussion is really talking about the argument for and the argument against, the pros and the cons. So you'd want to have at least one argument for something and at least one argument against something. So you might say about having fewer children, well, of course, if there are fewer children, there'll be less deforestation, there'll be less need for housing, there'll be less carbon released into the atmosphere. But again, there is a moral question. You might want to express that. Can you tell people not to have children? And the moral question in this essay is probably one that you should talk about. And it's a question which has been discussed at length in many countries. And I'm thinking about India, for example, and also in China. Then the third paragraph about technology. Well, what are the pros and cons of using technology to protect the resources of the world? And again, you might have a few ideas about the most important technology. You might talk about renewable resources and things like that. Well, of course, renewable resources are renewable, and we're not using finite resources. But what are the arguments against that? Well, they are expensive to begin with, and maybe not every country has the ability or the size to produce a lot of power immediately. And then your concluding paragraph will re-express, reiterate, repeat your position that you talked about in the first paragraph. Or you might even have this is a 4-paragraph answer, but you might have 5 paragraphs. You might spend another paragraph discussing your position and then a brief conclusion. But I would always recommend that your conclusion has something to say about the future. And this is a very typical way of finishing an essay in English, in any language really, because you've been talking about a problem, you've been talking about a solution, and really it's quite natural to say, well, if people start to do this, then in 10 or 20 or 100 years, then things will be much better. So looking towards the future is quite a standard way of concluding an essay such as this. So let's look at point 5 here. And we've talked about many different things that you could include in an essay, but if you included all of those things, the essay would be very, very long. And you only want 250 words, maybe 260, maybe 270, but not really very many more than that. So what are your best points? And what are your points that you can express clearly? Sometimes we have an idea which is a good idea, but we don't know how to express it. Well, forget that idea. Don't try and express something which is too difficult to express. Leave that, okay? Restrict yourself. And this is an important thing in all writing. Restrict yourself to what can be expressed clearly. And if you do that, you'll find that everything else will be improved. Your lexical resource will be used effectively. Your grammar will not be too difficult. You'll be able to express a position clearly. That's the task response. And you'll be able to make it more cohesive, which is the second assessment criterion in IELTS, coherence and cohesion. We're going to look at coherence and cohesion in a bit more detail when we look at the model answer. We'll look at some linking words. Okay, so if you, before the test, long before the test, you should be routinely every day reading articles that cover the sorts of issues that you will find in an IELTS writing test or an IELTS speaking test. And remember, the sorts of topics in writing and speaking are quite similar in IELTS. And those topics are the ones that an educated person will talk about with their friends, maybe talk about at university, but they're not purely academic. They are important issues which normal educated people will talk about. And one of my favorite online resources is an online magazine called The Conversation. And this is a very useful tool for you because the language is not very difficult, but the issues are very important. And the people who write for this online magazine are academics. Now, academics are usually not very good at expressing themselves clearly, but these academics work with editors to try and simplify their ideas for a general audience. And the article that I pointed out here is written by an academic from New Zealand, from the University of Waikato, and he is someone who is a professor in economics and is talking about the effect of population growth on the environment. And it's quite a clear explanation of his position. And there are some very good points made and some very good language that you could use yourself. It speaks about Japan in the last part of this article, and it talks about a Japanese academic who is talking about the effect of population control, but other things that can also lead to an improvement in emissions and climate change. So it's interesting, and you might find that interesting. You can look at that in your own time. But when we look at something like this, it's important that you are an active reader. And that means that you are asking yourself questions about what you're reading, and you're also trying to get from your reading as much as you can that you can use in your own writing. And we're going to look at how you can do that when we look at the model answer, which is coming up next. Now, this model answer is from the book that I mentioned, the IDP Education Preparation book, which is published in Japan, in Japanese, and which I and a few other people have had some input into. And this model answer is a band 9. It could be improved probably in some ways, but really it doesn't have to be perfect to be a band 9. And that is something that is important to remember. If you look at the assessment criteria, the public version of the assessment criteria for task 2 writing, you will see that you can make a few mistakes here or there in your grammar. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect to get to a band 9. In this essay, there are no mistakes. It could be expanded, it could be improved, but it really is as good as could be expected in 40 minutes, which is what you have for writing a task 2. So let's read it. As we read it, I'll just point out a few of the little things that I'd like you to do when you read an article such as the one we looked at in the conversation. And in the first paragraph, the thing that I want you to look at is the use of gerunds, G-E-R-U-N-D, right? the verb used as a noun. Now, in formal, slightly academic writing in English, it's very common to use a noun instead of a verb. And I'll explain this as we go. If we look at the first sentence, it is expected that there will be shortages of world resources in the future because the population of the world is increasing. Okay, so this is a nice rephrasing of some of the ideas in the task. Instead of saying preserving the world's limited resources, they talk about there will be shortages of world resources because the population is increasing. Now, I've highlighted a few things that you might use in your own writing. Some people think that, okay? Now, some people think that is a rephrasing of the task, which was some people believe. Population control, and then we say, that is. What comes after that is the gerund, having. Having fewer children is a noun phrase. We've made a noun out of a verb because this is quite natural in a formal bit of English writing. I could leave it as a verb, but it wouldn't sound very formal. You know, we could say some people think that population control, that is, people, when people have lots of children, that would not sound particularly formal. And remember, in an academic writing, task 2 writing, you don't have to be very formal, but you should try and have a little bit of that formality. So having fewer children, that's a noun, is the most effective solution for this problem. Now imagine we're writing an essay about education, for example. Some people think that better schools, okay, we're talking about improving education, better schools. And now I'm going to explain better schools. That is, employing more teachers. That is, better training for teachers. That is, providing more money for schools. Do you see here, I've used the gerund to explain what the issue is. Population control, having fewer children. Better schools, employing more teachers. This is something that you can do for yourself and practice that. Practice explaining an idea by using a gerund and using that connecting phrase, that is. In other words, comma, is the most effective solution for this problem. Okay, effective solution. That is a nice collocation. Those two words go together. Effective, solution. It's a nice linking of two ideas. And remember, in a band 7, 8, and 9 in an IELTS task 2, the examiner is looking for these natural connections of words. Adjective and noun. Effective, solution. However, others believe technological development is the key to. And you see that word to? What is it? It's a preposition. Now, when you have a preposition, you can have a gerund after that. And we have one here. The key to preserving our non-renewable resources. So when you have a preposition like to, then the next word won't be a verb, it will be the noun form of the verb, because after a preposition, you must have a noun. So is the key to, let's go back to education, that having better teachers is the key to improving education. If we're talking about crime, it's the key to stopping crime or reducing unemployment if we're talking about jobs. We have the key to the preposition, and then we follow it with a gerund: employing, spending, improving, stopping, reducing, training, providing. So think about that. Think about ways that you can use these structures in any essay, not just about population control and world's resources. It could be about anything. So there we have an example of using the gerund, and it continues in this paragraph. In my opinion, technology is a better solution than, another preposition here, controlling. Again, the gerund. So it's a better solution than just controlling the size of the population. If we're talking about education, it's a better solution than just giving more money to schools. If we're talking about crime, it's a better solution than just employing more police. So again, these phrases, you can use them in all of your essays as long as you practice using them and think about using the gerund in that case. Okay, so that first paragraph is quite a good one. It's following the task very closely and sufficiently. It is presenting a position, which is important in an English essay, that you make the reader aware early of what you think. It's addressing both of the views, rephrasing where necessary. So it's a very effective and appropriate introductory paragraph. So then the second paragraph looks at the first idea of population control. And this writer uses the example of China, which is probably the most famous example of population control in the world at the moment. And in this paragraph, I'd like to look at the linking words, because this is an important part of expressing ideas in an opinion essay, and it's explicitly assessed under the second criterion for IELTS Task 2, that is coherence and cohesion. Coherence and cohesion, if you look there at band 7, they talk about uses a range of cohesive devices, and what we're looking at is a very effective use of cohesive devices. Bands 8 and 9 have all of those things as well, but they don't bother talking about them. They just say that manages all aspects of cohesion well. In other words, the cohesive devices, the linking words, reference, and all sorts of other things as well. So looking at that second paragraph now, we see that the first word in the second paragraph is recently. Now, I haven't highlighted that, but it's an important one, because in this paragraph, you will see a particular tense, a particular verb tense used. And what tense is that? It's the present perfect tense. Has tried, has had, has limited, has not led to. Why are we using the present perfect in this paragraph so much? Well, it's because we use the word recently. And recently means in the past, but we're not saying exactly when in the past. It's in the past, but it's up to now, and it's still true. And that is the present perfect tense. And the present perfect tense is very important in English, and it's very often used when we are talking about the past, but we're not saying exactly when. If we said in 1979, which is when the one-child policy was brought in, if we said in 1979, we would have to say China tried, because that would be the definite past. That would be not the present perfect. That would be a time that is finished. But now we're talking about a time in the past which is not finished. It's come right up to today. So if we think about this, recently China has tried population control with its one-child policy, but this policy has had some problems. This policy, important that we understand what this means. In other words, the one-child policy. This is an element of coherence and cohesion. This is called reference. I understand what this is referring to. Then we have some linking words which I've highlighted: while, at best, furthermore, notably. These words are adverbs or conjunctions, or adverbs that operate as conjunctions. And these are the sorts of words that the examiner is looking for in order to give you a high score for your coherence and cohesion, the second criterion in task 2. And here, these are used very well. While limiting the numbers of children has limited the size of the population, this has not necessarily led to a decreased demand on resources. This adverb necessarily is very good. At best, limiting the population seems only to keep resource use stable. So resource use there is a noun. Furthermore, population and demand for resources continues in all other parts of the world, notably India, South America, and Africa. So the use of these adverbs and these linking devices really connects the ideas together in a very effective and efficient way. And these are words that are important for you to learn how to use. And the more you read in English, the more you read this sort of thing in English, and go back to the conversation, remember, that online magazine, you will see how you can use those sorts of words effectively. So when you read, remember, be an active reader and think, how can I use these words and these phrases myself? So the rest of that essay goes on in a predictable manner. The third paragraph looks at the other view. On the other hand, technical development can significantly change the amount of spending on resources, for example, because of improved efficiency, etc., etc. You can read that for yourself. I don't need to really go into that myself, I don't think. And finally, the paragraph that finishes this essay begins in a rather predictable way, but an effective way, to sum up. You could use other ways of saying this, in summary, or you might use a word even like clearly to express that you are now making the definitive statement, the final statement. Technical developments make the world's limited resources more efficient. So here, this person is not really introducing very much new. They are actually adding they are expanding their idea, but they are making it very clear what their position is. And remember, in task response, the first assessment criterion in task 2, you are asked to make your position clear, and the examiner wants to see a clear position. So basically, what I want you to do is read that again, look at it very closely, think about how you can use those sorts of phrases, the linking phrases, the gerunds that we were looking at. Look at the structure of an essay such as that, 4 paragraphs. But of course, if the task is different, there may be 5 paragraphs. There might be 5 paragraphs in this task as well, if you want to. But this is about 268 words, which I would recommend as a maximum, because then you will have a chance to review your work, check for errors and things like that as well. But remember, you have some things to do long before the exam. You need to read a lot of those sorts of things and read them actively. So, Yuki, I'm happy to leave my little bit there. And would you like to add anything about the sorts of challenges that your students might have with a task like that?
Yeah. So, well, if we just go back to our brainstorming, which we've talked about here. So I find a lot of students will have a lot of good ideas. They might think about things like, I've recycled this and that in my daily life, or I can think of an example where population control has taken place. But how do you organize all your ideas so that when you write an essay, you have a clear central topic in the paragraph and the logical progression throughout the
So we had a lot of ideas there, and in this model answer, this writer only used a few of them, but they used them quite effectively and quite clearly. So that is what I would recommend if you feel confident about talking about a particular item. Then talk about that. If you're not very confident about talking about another issue or idea that came up in brainstorming, then maybe just leave that aside. It would be good to have at least a couple of examples to support a view, but you don't really need very much more than that, I think.
Yes. So you would say, in some ways, the fewer the ideas, the better, in some ways.
Yeah.
You don't want to overload your essay with
absolutely.
ideas.
I agree.
Okay. I think maybe another thing that we can just look at with this essay is that the language is not overly complicated.
Yeah.
It's a sort of language. It's not that far from the language you would use in your daily life, is it?
No. It's not highly formal, and it's a good point you make that some candidates think that they have to produce a complex sentence every sentence, but in this essay you can see, for example, the last sentence is a short and sweet sentence, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. Good writing is a combination of short sentences and longer sentences, and there's you don't want to be writing all of your sentences as too long, and you don't want to be writing all of your sentences as too short.
Great. So definitely use a mix of simple and complex sentences, which is something that's in the band descriptors as well, isn't it?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yes. We can have a look. So band 6, you have a mix of simple and complex sentence forms. Band 7, a variety of complex structures. a wide variety of structures.
Mm.
I suppose, yes, a wide variety of structures means not necessarily the most complicated sentence you can write all the time.
No. And if you look at band 9, full flexibility. Flexibility means that you are flexible enough to use a short sentence when it's appropriate as well. You're not locked in to an idea that of having to produce a particular type of sentence all the time.
Mm-hmm. はい。皆さんの方からいかがでしょうか。何かご質問ありましたら、ぜひチャットの方に、送っていただきたいんですけれども、何かこの機会に、ライティングなんでも特に、聞いておきたいことでしたり、今日のところで、さらに、ある方はぜひ送ってください。So, what else can I think of? There's quite a few things obviously we could talk about, but yes, so planning an essay. Yes, so the time pressure in an exam, I think, is another thing that that some students struggle with. They might find, even a 10-minute block that you might have in mind might not be enough. So,
well, there's something you have to practice.
A method of planning is something that's important.
Yeah. And, you need to practice 2 things. You need to practice, you've got to practice 3 things. You got to practice planning an essay quickly.
Mm-hmm.
You got to practice writing the essay, obviously, but you've also got to practice reviewing what you've written and correcting it. And those 2 things, that's the first and the last part, are things that you really should practice to be able to do them efficiently. For example, a student should know the sorts of mistakes they make, and they should know what they're looking for when they do review their work.
Yeah. So definitely leave, would you say maybe 3 or 4 minutes to at least review your essay?
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah.
And again, this goes back to when I first went for my license. Many years ago, back in I think it was in the middle of the last century.
Yes.
And having a method made me more relaxed. My driving instructor taught me a method, and the consequence of that wasn't just that I was an effective driver, I was a relaxed driver. That helped me perform well in the test.
What were some of the methods in your driving test?
Well, I went through my test 3 times.
Yes.
The first 2 times, I was so nervous that I forgot the handbrake, for example.
Yes.
And I didn't notice that I was going down a one-way street as well. But my next instructor gave me some methods about how to park and things like that, line up things and all that sort of stuff. And so I was much more relaxed. I was also older too.
Yes. A little bit of extra wisdom doesn't hurt, but so definitely a method. So things you can, methods of constructing an essay, things you can do to check your essay and so on. Definitely, keep practicing those. Great. Okay, well, I think that basically takes us up to our time for today. So I think we'll have to leave it there. And I'll be sharing this document with the students later, so they can learn again from the model answer, the wonderful model answer that we had.
Are we going to give any prizes, Yuki?
Yes, well, I'll do that.
It's up to you. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll be quiet.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. それでは今日はここまでにしますね。来月もまた、どんどんライティングのセミナーを行っていきますので、またライティングの中でもちょっと違ったアングルからセミナーを行いますので、また来月も楽しみにしていて、ぜひ参加してください。Alright, so thanks, Don, and we'll see you next month for the next seminar.
Alright, see you later.